Welcome back again to another episode of the Young Writer's Vlog. We're here to talk about another piece of writing advice that you've probably heard a lot over the course of your career. Show, don't tell, and what exactly that bit of advice really means. It's a very common phrase, one that is often not really accompanied by what exactly we mean when we say it. This is made more complex by the fact that, like other writing rules, this is a concept rather than a law. This is something that you should do most of the time, not every single time. Now, the phrase show, don't tell refers broadly to the idea that, in most cases, it's better to show the audience something happening rather than tell them about something that has happened. This is why the rule exists in the first place, because showing the audience something gives them a more personal connection to it compared to just telling them about it. In practice, there are two general situations where this rule is important. The first case is when you're talking about individual characters' personalities and their traits. In this case, it's basically good form to always follow this rule. It's always better for your characters to show their personalities through the choices they make and the things that they say, rather than you as a writer simply telling us they have this trait and assuming that we'll just trust you on that. Because no matter how much you tell the audience that Barry is compassionate and always looks after his friends, if he never actually shows this character trait, then why even bother mentioning it? If it never comes up, then it's probably not all that important to mention in the first place, and you should probably just drop the reference to it. And on the other hand, if he acts in ways that are decidedly not compassionate, or he has the opportunity to show his compassion but chooses not to, then it's gonna feel like you lied to us about Barry's character traits here. And if you do this poorly, you can really feel like you have an unreliable narrator, or worse, an unreliable writer. In the end, no one enjoys being told what to think about someone. We prefer to make our own opinions and have the chance to see who they are as a person before we make such judgments. So when describing characters, it's very important to try and limit the amount that you describe their personality and their character traits, focusing more on the way they appear and the way they move in order to express those character traits. Describing the things that they're doing is how you communicate to the audience that they have these traits. You don't really get to say that Alice is very smart and then pretend that everyone now knows that Alice is smart. That's just something you've told us. We don't actually know it to be true. Now, the second reason we use the show don't tell rule is when we're referring to how information is referred to the audience about things that are happening and events that are unfolding. In this regard, the advice is pretty simple. It's more engaging to show the audience something as it is happening rather than tell us about what happened at a later time or just summarize it briefly. This comes up a lot in storytelling because storytelling is essentially telling an audience about stuff that is happening, and the two ways to do it are to simply say that this thing happened and this is why it's important, or you can take the longer and more thorough route and explore this thing as it is happening so the audience gets to see it for themselves. Most of the time you should be doing that second thing. The audience should feel immersed in all of these interesting story facets that are happening. Now, this can create problems because often the context for why things are important relies on you knowing about other things that happened. And then when you're showing that other thing that's happening, well, the context of that relies on all of this previous stuff that happened, and suddenly you're just going flashback after flashback of things happening all the way through the beginning of time, and you don't have time to go back to the beginning of time to show the reader absolutely everything they could possibly need to know in order to understand why this is important. Sometimes you just have to take that shortcut. You just have to tell them, this thing happened, that's why this other thing is super important. This is why the advice to show instead of telling is a little bit weird, because we don't, as writers, have time to show everything. Every time we want to tell the reader something, that takes up space and time in our stories, that detracts from our ability to tell them about anything else. And if we spend all of our time focusing on the minor details of the story, we take that time away from the major details of the story. It's really important to have a balance of showing versus telling, and knowing when to do one and when to do the other. This is where I tend to use the advice, show if you can, tell if you can't. If there's any bit of history that the audience needs to see or context they need to understand, try to show that to them. Try to tell it through their story. Try to get the audience involved in the telling of it. If it takes a long time to tell and the detail is relatively minor, or it feels out of place based on the rest of the story, or it's so far removed from what is happening right now that it would feel out of place to show, then just tell instead. Just take a moment and say, this character just got out of that building. If it's something the audience needs to see happening, but you don't have time to show it happening, just saying it happens is a good workaround. That being said, focusing on showing first will make your storytelling much more engaging, because there are very interesting ways you can show tidbits of information. Instead of having a narrator talk about how Charlie cheated on his last girlfriend just before his current girlfriend accuses him of cheating, have another character talk to him about that earlier. Have it come up in another conversation. A couple chapters before, have a flashback showing this happened, so that when the audience sees this event where he's accused of cheating again, they can recall that this has happened before. They know this without you interrupting the story at all. When you focus on showing first, it gives you opportunities to see how you can make your storytelling more engaging by making sure your audience is included in the world you're creating. You should never miss an opportunity to show the audience something interesting that's happening in your world. You should never shy away from revealing all of the intricate aspects of your world. If you have the opportunity to show your audience why your story is important, show them. Don't rely on just telling them that this is important, telling them that this is interesting. Show it happening. Have it happen in front of their eyes so they can see that it is important, that they can see that it is interesting, and so that they can feel like they're immersed in the storyline. Because there's so many interesting ways to work these stories into a narrative. You have flashbacks, flash forwards, you have montages. You have so many tools at your disposal for showing your audience cool things. There's no excuse not to use them. And that being said, there are times when you don't want to use them. There are several specific situations where telling the audience something is happening is better than showing it to them. To show you what I mean, here are a couple of those exceptions. First is that telling is faster than showing. As I said earlier, everything that you tell the audience takes up space and their attention, and sometimes for reasons of pacing and attention, you just don't have time to show the reader everything that you want to. There's some things that just aren't as important as the time it would take to show them this thing happening. In this case, you might want to have the narrator summarize it or have a character talk about this thing that happened. As a writer, it's important to know when you should summarize things that the audience needs to know, but you don't have time to show them. The best time to do this is, as I mentioned earlier in the conversation of detail, is when you don't want to break up a fast-paced or intense sequence with a long flashback or a cutaway to something happening somewhere else. In the interest of time, sometimes you can just tell them that something happened off screen. Though this is, of course, only if they absolutely need to know that this happened. If you can wait a while and show them this happening later in your story, then do that. But if you have to tell them now and you don't have time to show it, just tell them. Unless, of course, it's better that they don't know. It is good to surprise your audience every once in a while with things that they didn't expect, especially if after the fact they can logically infer the reasons why this thing happened. The other best time to utilize summarization is in time skips. If your story has a significant gap in time where nothing particularly relevant to the story happens, it can be pretty exhausting to have a montage showing all of these day-to-day adjustments as this very long period of time elapses. Sometimes it is better and even more interesting to just tell the audience the result of all of these actions. Again, you want to be careful here because there are often very interesting ways to show the audience these changes without telling them, especially if a main character was out of the story for several years. Having them discover all of these changes on their own and interact with the results of these actions is often much more engaging than simply telling the reader that these things happened and then moving on from there. The second way that telling cannot do showing is when characters are the ones doing the telling. Whether it's because your narrator is the character or you have two characters speaking to each other, hearing about the world through its characters is an important tool in story creation. Bear in mind, however, that if done poorly, this can be worse than simply telling the audience that thing through narration. The fact is, if you try to avoid telling the audience something by just having a character dictate that thing you were going to tell them anyways, that's actually worse than just doing it through narration because you don't want to create boring conversations or have situations where two characters are talking about things that no two people would ever talk about. Let's go to an example for this. Oh, it's a good day here on Kepler 5 where gravity is only 1/2 as strong as it is on Sol 3, Bob said. Alice responded, "Oh, you mean the planet where humans are originally from?" "Yes, that exact same one," Bob said. The problem here is that people don't have conversations about things that they know that the other person already knows. Social interactions don't work this way. So when you're trying to have your characters tell the audience things that you need them to know, it's important to make sure that not only is the conversation relevant or believable, it still has to be entertaining and engaging. Just because you have to tell your audience something is no excuse to bore them. So you have to use this tool carefully, but it is actually very effective when used correctly because this is a tool that can both inform your readers about the world while also giving a sample of that character's perspective on that world. This is especially useful if that character's understanding of the world is flawed in some important way that's revealed later. It can be a very good tactic to have a character talk about the world in a way that's slightly wrong so that you can reveal they were wrong when it is most conveniently appropriate for you story-wise. In the end, showing rather than telling is about making your story more engaging. It's about making sure your audience experiences things in the most interesting and involving way possible. So choosing whether or not to show or to tell is about what choice makes your story better. You have to think about what's the most interesting way to receive this information. What's the best way to have these characters act and talk about each other so that the audience has a clear picture of who they are as people. Because if your story is interesting and your characters are engaging, then your audience will want to see all of these things They'll want to see them in person. They want to see these happen, and they'll feel cheated if instead of that, they're simply told about all of these cool things happening off screen. They're just told that these characters are doing these things and acting in such ways. We want to see that. We want to see that happening. We want to see those events unfold in front of our eyes so that we have an understanding of this world that is not just what you've told us, but is what we've seen based on the things that you've described. Have the courage to let us form our own opinions about things. Have confidence that after seeing something happen, we'll understand why it's important without you telling us. Show if you can and tell if you can't. Thank you for joining me on this episode of the Young Writers Vlog. And until next time, have a good night and keep on writing. Of course, this also applies to teaching, which is unfortunate because I'm not really sure how to show this concept in action without just, spending a lot of time showing a bunch of bad examples.